The machinery of power doesn't break down in a single moment. It unravels thread by thread, and what we're witnessing right now is one of those threads being pulled with tremendous force. When a former president begins to demonstrate visible signs of panic, when the carefully constructed narratives start to collapse under the weight of evidence, we're not just observing political theater. We're watching the exposure of how power protects itself, how institutions can be weaponized to shield the powerful, and how that protection fails when the contradictions become too glaring to sustain. What's emerging in this case isn't simply about one individual losing composure. It's about a system that has, for decades, allowed certain figures to operate above accountability. The alleged cover-up we're examining reveals the intersection of political influence, institutional complicity, and the structural mechanisms that determine who faces consequences and who doesn't. This isn't about partisan allegiance or political preference. This is about understanding how power functions when it's threatened, how it responds when exposure becomes unavoidable, and what that tells us about the deeper fragility within our political and judicial systems. The unraveling itself is the story, because it exposes everything the system was designed to hide. Let me begin by asking you to think about what happens when a narrative that has been carefully maintained, meticulously protected, and defended at all costs suddenly begins to show cracks. We've seen this pattern throughout history, not just in American politics, but in every system where power consolidates itself around individuals who believe they are, in some fundamental way, untouchable. The phenomenon we're observing right now with Donald Trump isn't new. What's new is the speed at which the protective layers are being stripped away, and the visibility of that process in our modern media landscape. When I say he's losing it, I'm not speaking casually or using hyperbole for effect. I'm describing an observable pattern of behavior that reflects what happens when someone who has spent decades insulated from consequences suddenly confronts the possibility that those consequences might finally arrive. Now let's ground this in the material reality of what we're actually discussing. There are allegations, serious, credible allegations, that point toward a cover-up involving a death, potentially a murder, and the subsequent efforts to conceal the truth about what happened. The details matter enormously, but what matters even more for our understanding is the structure that made such a cover-up possible in the first place. You see, cover-ups don't happen in a vacuum. They require institutional support, complicit actors at multiple levels, and most importantly, they require a system that has already demonstrated its willingness to look the other way when powerful people commit acts that would destroy ordinary citizens. This is where we need to connect the dots between individual behavior and systemic failure. Think about the ecosystem that surrounds a figure like Trump. We're talking about lawyers who specialize in making problems disappear, political operatives whose entire careers are built on narrative management, media allies who amplify preferred versions of events while suppressing inconvenient truths, and law enforcement officials who understand implicitly which investigations to pursue aggressively and which to handle with extraordinary caution. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is how power actually operates in practice. The cover-up we're examining didn't require a smoke-filled room with people plotting in whispers. It required a network of individuals who understood their roles, who knew what was expected of them, and who had been rewarded throughout their careers for demonstrating loyalty to power rather than commitment to truth. What's fascinating about this particular moment is that we can see the unraveling happening in real time. Trump's public statements have become increasingly erratic, increasingly defensive, and increasingly disconnected from the kind of strategic communication that characterized his earlier responses to scandals and investigations. When someone who has built an entire public persona on projecting strength and control begins to show visible signs of panic, that tells us something important about the internal calculus that's happening. He's not panicking because the allegations are new. Powerful people face allegations constantly. He's panicking because the mechanisms that have protected him in the past are failing to perform their function. The cover-up is unraveling not because someone suddenly developed a conscience, but because the contradictions and inconsistencies have accumulated to a point where they can no longer be effectively managed. Let me take you deeper into the economics of this situation because everything in our society ultimately connects back to economic power and economic structures. Trump's entire career, long before he entered politics, was built on a particular kind of economic arrangement. He understood that in American capitalism, having money, or more precisely, having access to credit and the appearance of wealth, grants you certain privileges. Among those privileges is the ability to hire the best legal defense, to settle lawsuits quietly, to make problems go away through financial means, and to use the threat of expensive litigation to intimidate anyone who might challenge you. This economic dimension of power is absolutely critical to understanding how cover-ups function. The person who can afford to pay $1 million to make a problem disappear lives in a fundamentally different reality than the person who can't afford a competent lawyer. But here's where it gets even more interesting from a structural perspective. The cover-up we're discussing involves not just Trump's personal resources, but the resources of the political apparatus that surrounded him during his presidency. When you're the President of the United States, you have access to institutional power that goes far beyond personal wealth. You can influence investigations through your appointment of key officials. You can use executive privilege to shield information from public scrutiny. You can deploy the entire communications infrastructure of the federal government to shape public perception. And perhaps most importantly, you can rely on partisan political dynamics to ensure that roughly half the country will reflexively defend you regardless of the evidence, because defending you has become synonymous with defending their political identity. This brings us to a crucial question. What happens when all of these protective mechanisms begin to fail simultaneously? We're seeing it now. The legal protections are eroding as courts reject spurious claims of privilege and immunity. The political protections are weakening as even some allies begin to distance themselves when the legal jeopardy becomes too severe. The media protections are fragmenting as the sheer volume of evidence makes it impossible even for friendly outlets to maintain complete narrative control. And the economic protections are under strain as legal costs mount and as potential financial penalties from various cases create real material pressure. The alleged murder and its cover-up sit at the intersection of all these failing systems. When we talk about a murder being covered up, we're not just talking about hiding a body or destroying evidence, though those may be components. We're talking about controlling information flows, managing witness testimony, influencing investigative priorities, and shaping the legal proceedings to minimize exposure. Every single one of those activities requires the cooperation of multiple actors within multiple systems. And every single one of those actors is now facing their own calculation. Is continued loyalty worth the personal risk they're being asked to assume? This is where the human element enters the structural analysis. People participate in cover-ups because they believe they'll be protected, because they believe the system will shield them just as it shields the principal figure they're protecting. But when that principal figure starts to show weakness, when the legal walls start closing in, when the possibility of criminal liability becomes real rather than theoretical, people begin to reconsider their choices. We've seen this pattern repeatedly throughout history. The strong man appears invincible until suddenly he doesn't, and then the defections begin. Not because people suddenly develop moral courage, but because the rational calculation of self-interest shifts. What Trump is experiencing right now is the erosion of that perceived invincibility. Every erratic statement, every visible sign of stress, every defensive outburst reinforces the perception that the protection is failing. And that perception becomes self-fulfilling because it accelerates the very defections and revelations that make the protection fail more completely. This is the dialectical process of political collapse. The internal contradictions of the system reach a point where they can no longer be contained, and the attempt to contain them actually accelerates their explosion into public view. Now, I want to address the moral dimension of this situation, because morality and power are always intertwined, even though we often analyze them separately. The cover-up of a murder isn't just a legal crime, it's a moral obscenity. It represents the ultimate expression of the belief that some lives matter more than others, that some people are entitled to literally get away with murder, while others face severe punishment for minor infractions. This moral dimension connects directly to the broader questions about American society that I've spent my career examining. We live in a system that generates profound inequalities, not just of wealth, but of dignity, of rights, of access to justice. The cover-up we're discussing is an extreme manifestation of that inequality, But it's not an aberration from the system. It's a logical extension of how the system actually functions. When Trump and his allies allegedly worked to conceal a murder, they were operating on assumptions that have been validated thousands of times throughout American history. They assumed that power protects its own. They assumed that money can buy silence and complicity. They assumed that political influence can redirect investigations and suppress evidence. They assumed that partisan tribalism would ensure that a significant portion of the population would reject any allegations regardless of evidence. And until very recently, all of those assumptions appeared to be correct. The fact that they're now being proven wrong doesn't mean the system has suddenly become just. It means that this particular set of circumstances has generated enough pressure that the normal protective mechanisms are buckling. Let's talk about what this means for accountability more broadly. If Trump actually faces serious legal consequences for his role in this alleged cover-up, it won't represent the system working as intended. It will represent an exceptional breakdown of the system's normal function, which is to protect powerful people from accountability. That's not a cynical observation. That's the empirical description of how American justice has functioned throughout our history. We incarcerate more people than any nation on earth, but those people are overwhelmingly poor and disproportionately people of color. Meanwhile, wealthy individuals and corporate executives routinely escape prosecution for crimes that destroy communities and economies. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed, which is to enforce law harshly against the powerless while treating it as negotiable for the powerful. What makes this Trump situation potentially different is that his behavior has been so egregious, so public, and so obviously criminal that even the protective systems are struggling to function. It's like a body's immune system being overwhelmed by a pathogen that's too virulent to contain. The cover-up is unraveling, not because the system suddenly developed a conscience, but because the scale and visibility of the wrongdoing has exceeded the system's capacity to suppress it. This is an important distinction because it affects how we understand what's happening and what it might mean for future accountability. The panic we're seeing from Trump is rational from his perspective. He built his entire life on the assumption that he could always escape consequences through some combination of legal maneuvering, financial settlements, political pressure, and media manipulation. That formula worked for decades. It worked through multiple bankruptcies, through credible allegations of sexual assault, through obvious tax fraud, through incitement of violence, through attempts to overturn an election. But there appears to be a limit, and we may be witnessing him crash into that limit in real time. The alleged murder cover-up may represent the point where the accumulation of wrongdoing finally exceeds the system's ability to absorb and neutralize it. What should we, as observers and as citizens, take from this moment? First, we should recognize that individual accountability, while important, is not the same as systemic reform. Even if Trump faces consequences, the structures that enabled his behavior will remain intact unless we actively work to dismantle them. Second, we should understand that the unraveling we're witnessing didn't happen automatically. It happened because of the persistent work of investigators, journalists, whistleblowers, and others who refused to let the story die, despite enormous pressure to do so. Third, we should recognize that the moral clarity of this moment, the apparent exposure of a murder cover-up, shouldn't blind us to the countless other injustices that continue to be successfully covered up every single day because they don't involve such a high-profile figure. The truth is that our system covers up metaphorical murders constantly. The deaths from lack of health care, the deaths from environmental pollution, the deaths from poverty and desperation in the richest country on earth. These structural murders are sanitized and normalized because they don't involve a single identifiable perpetrator, but they're no less real and no less attributable to specific policy choices made by specific powerful people. So while we focus on this particular alleged murder and its cover-up, we shouldn't lose sight of the broader patterns of violence and concealment that define how power operates in America. As this story continues to develop, as more evidence emerges, and as the legal proceedings unfold, we'll need to maintain our analytical clarity. We'll need to distinguish between what's actually significant and what's merely sensational. We'll need to connect the specific details of this case to the broader patterns of power and accountability in our society. And most importantly, we'll need to ask ourselves what kind of system we want to build, one that continues to enable these cover-ups, or one that actually enforces accountability regardless of wealth and power? The unraveling we're witnessing right now is giving us a glimpse of what's possible when the protective mechanisms fail. The question is whether we'll use this moment to demand permanent structural change, or whether we'll simply wait for the next strongman to emerge with better protective mechanisms in place.